can I have the attention of the spring exercise MPPs for just a second? At the completion of Professor White's follow-up to this session with Senator Hagel, your briefing books will be on the right-hand side, and in order to pick them up, you'll need either your ID, or if you're picking them up for someone else, a letter indicating that. So at 6 o'clock, to your left will be your books to pick up, okay?
ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome. We're delighted and honored today to have Senator Hagel here. I'm John White. I'm involved in the spring exercise, and many of the students are here from spring exercise. I just wanted to have a remark about that. As you know, in terms of these 2 weeks for the spring exercise, we are bringing in speakers from outside who can lend a certain perspective to these issues. And today, we're really delighted because we have a very special guest in Senator Hagel, as the Dean will explain. But Senator Hagel and I were talking briefly outside, and a critical point here is the national perspective, and most importantly, the political perspective, particularly someone with such a distinguished record as Senator Hagel. So we're delighted that he's here, and he will be introduced by Dean Elwood, and so let me turn it over to David. David?
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Spring Exercise. This is a important couple of weeks for all of you, and each year there's a different intense exercise, usually something that's very much at the top of the agenda, and so very much look forward to the work that you all do. And you never know, you may change the world. I wanted today to introduce, I'm obviously here to introduce Senator Chuck Hagel. As part of this Military Challenges, his forum is entitled Military Challenges in the 21st Century. And he's going to use a somewhat different style today. He'll speak for a somewhat shorter time as is usual and leave more time for questions for all of you so that you have a chance to start focusing and getting questions. But he is a remarkable man who's overcome adversity, who's been brave in the face of great danger, and who brings great wisdom and thoughtfulness to the kind of challenges we're here to talk to today. He was born in the Sand Hills of Nebraska, and to a World War II veteran in 1946. He was really literally the start of the baby boom. His father worked in the lumber yards, but died on Christmas morning when Senator Hagel was 16 years old. As the oldest of 4 boys, his brothers and mother turned to him to be the man in the house. And in high school, he was a football star and president of the student council. His brother Tom once said in an interview, Chuck has always been a strong leader. He's strong in his opinions, and if he's in charge, he's in charge. Unfortunately, after winning a football scholarship, he was injured, and that cut short his academic and football career. And faced with adversity yet again, he attended Brown Institute for Radio and Television in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Being a Minnesotan myself, I admire that choice. It gave him a credential and a start. He got a job in broadcasting, appearing on the air, and also selling airtime. But with the Vietnam War in full swing, he volunteered for the Army. And as luck would have it, both he and his brother Tom were assigned to the same unit. And through the course of the year, in their military tour of duty, both nearly died. The first time, Tom saved his big brother's life. And the second time, his older brother saved his. His older brother saved him. They were just 19 and 21. After the war, and with 2 Purple Hearts, he went to the University of Nebraska at Omaha and worked for a local radio station. One day, his guest was a Congressman, John McAllister. He was impressed, asked for a job, and got it in the congressional office in D.C. Worked for him for 6 years. Now, this is the other important lesson in life. Networks, contacts, they matter. They can change your life. He then went to work for Firestone, served as vice chairman of Ronald Reagan's inaugural committee in 1980, deputy administrator of the Veterans Administration. He started his own business in cellular phones, Vanguard Cellular Systems, which, not coincidentally, ended in making him a millionaire. In 1995, Senator James Exon retired, and he entered the race, winning 56-42. In 2002, he won re-election with 83% of the vote. Washington pundits have a tough time describing him. They often call him a maverick. He's pro-life, pro-school vouchers, pro-school chair, pro-school prayer. But he also supports international organizations, believes Iraq's a mess. I will let him correct that framing, and has a lot of other deeply held and thoughtful views. Last fall, when taken to task by his home state paper for criticizing President Bush's execution of the war in Iraq, he responded in typical fashion. I have a responsibility to do everything I can to assure our men and women who are serving in uniform and their families that America has a policy that's worthy of their sacrifice. War is not an abstraction. I know. I've been to war. More recently, he's come up with his own proposal for solving Social Security, and last week he announced his interest in tackling the problems of the Kyoto Treaty and global warming. And indeed, his mentor, John McAllister, told his wife she better get used to the fact that her husband was going to be running for president someday. But don't trust him. Trust your fellow students. 3 Kennedy School students, Paul Scott, Kevin Bork, and Amanda Coe, received significant amount of attention in the Nebraska press when they predicted that Senator Hagel would win the 2008 presidential election. They said, Hagel's straight talk will win over moderate voters and those who feel that our foreign policy warrants better management. So you heard it here first. We have a prediction by the wise and woolly Kennedy School students. And here you also have a chance to hear from Senator Chuck Hagel, who will talk about the very pressing issues that you're exploring on military preparedness. Senator Hagel?
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I am not here to announce my candidacy for president, and I do appreciate the confidence shown in me by those enlightened students that projected out into 208. I was with Governor Romney today, who some have suggested he might have an interest in running for president. I think I would encourage him to do that if that's something that he feels he should do and wants to do. I know our topic is not about the American presidency today, but I am at the John F. Kennedy School of Politics, and I would just say one thing about 2008. This will be an historic election in 2008 for many reasons, but it will represent the first time in many, many years for the Republicans since 1952 where there's really no heir apparent and no successor to the current incumbent president. I think the Democrat nominating process is as wide open as well. So both parties will have an immense historic opportunity to frame their party and to frame the philosophy of that party and choose representatives of their party who best represents that philosophy. And I suspect over the next 2 years, both parties may well shift in some of the focus of their priorities for the next few years. So that's about all I can tell you, because that's about all I know about 2008. Let me address the subject that you are dealing with today in maybe a briefer form than is normally the case here, and then spend the time with you, seeing what's on your minds and what questions, advice, counsel, whatever you'd like to offer. I'd like to respond to that. I will begin by thanking Harvard and for this forum, and you, Dean, and Secretary White, others, for the good work that you continually do to help educate and form a strong base of responsible citizens that this institute produces. Yes, you educate, but education is as much about preparation and responsibilities as any one thing, and you do that superbly well here, and to all of you, thank you. Also to see someone like Sheila Burke, who understands the realities of governance, and you all know, I think, Ms. Burke, when she was Chief of Staff to Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole, she dealt with some of these big issues on a regular basis. So all of you who have had experience in government and continue to transfer that experience, thank you, and to all the teachers. As was noted, I spent a year in Vietnam in 1968. I came back from Vietnam on December 4th, 1968. And when I came back, our United States Army had 1.6 million men and women. A great bulk of that 1.6 million men and women were represented by a draftee status. A good deal of those men and women in Vietnam were draftees, products of the selective service system. And it was during that 1968 presidential election that some of you in this room remember, others are studying, that Mr. Nixon suggested the possibility of an all-voluntary army. This was not just only in the context of his Vietnamization program that he was talking about, his way of extricating the United States from Vietnam, but he embroidered around that policy some rather specific policy suggestions. After he was elected in 1968 by, as you know, a close vote, early in his term in 1969, he impaneled a commission to look at the possibility of an all-voluntary force. Somewhat new in its concept. Remember, Vietnam was still very active at the time. Other nations that had tried something like an all-voluntary army. Many concerns, many questions. First being, could in fact you supply our force structure with an adequate number of men and women if you went to an all-voluntary force? Because that would mean, of course, first you would have to upgrade the benefits, beginning with a pay structure. And whether that really would work or not was in some question. Then President Nixon had the benefit of having the pressures of Vietnam essentially on his side on this issue, because if you would move to an all-voluntary force, that would mean that most likely you would disband the draft, that you would not reinstitute the draft, which was up for a review and action by the Congress in 1973. I've always thought that that additional pressure probably helped Nixon in his efforts to move this country in an all-voluntary force direction as much as any other one thing. At that point, you recall, at least whether you read about it or studied it, some of you were here, the United States had a very intense anti-war movement in 1969, which moved into 1970, 71. So that force helped Nixon, I believe. 1973, the Congress did not reinstitute the draft. And there was a considerable period of time where there was a gap with great uncertainty whether, in fact, that all-voluntary force structure and this new law would, in fact, work. At the same time, we still had some responsibilities in Vietnam, as well as other force structure commitments around the world. Those of you who are in the audience who were in the military at that time or are in the military now understand this time very well, as former Deputy Secretary of Defense White understands this, and understands the significant risk that was taken at that time. Because when you had no draft and you were counting on a new system to bring in a force structure that you were going to need, and we were extricating ourselves from Vietnam, so the same pressure wasn't there in 73, but it was a significant gamble. At the same time this was occurring, you were seeing in great numbers middle-level officers, major lieutenant colonels, leave the military. They saw an army in complete disarray, terrible morale, racial problems, which I saw in Vietnam. And a lot of the best men and women in our armed forces, especially in the Army, said, I don't want any part of this. and they left. Those that stayed, remained, made a commitment to themselves and their colleagues. Men like Lieutenant Colonel Colin Powell and Lieutenant Colonel Barry McCaffrey and Lieutenant Colonel Norman Schwarzkopf and many others like them. They stayed, and they stayed for one principal reason, to not only to be part of reinventing the military with an all-voluntary force, but professionalizing it like no time in the history of our country. And they were going to make this work, and they were committed to giving the American people a first-class force structure, one that was not only worthy of our country and our heritage, our tradition, but of the men and women themselves. Men and women in uniform deserve to be led by competent officers and competent NCOs. They deserve the best this country could give them. They deserve a commitment to their futures and their careers, and they deserve a commitment to their families. When I left the Army, when I came home from Vietnam in 1968, less than 25% of our Army was married. Today, of course, that's significantly higher. When you look at the officer corps, about 65 to 70% of our officer corps is married, well over 50% of our enlisted corps married, both over half with families. That was totally foreign to our force structure in 68 when I came back, and at the time we instituted an all-voluntary Army. Mainly they were single individuals in the military, so that was an additional pressure. But Powell and Schwarzkopf and McCaffrey and others stayed, and they committed themselves to a first-rate military for this country. And in fact, over the next 30 years, built the finest military institution, infrastructure, Army, force structure the world had ever seen. Best led, best trained, best equipped, best supported. The quality of those individuals went up. High school graduates, many college graduates, a new focus on education, a new focus on history, a new focus on tradition and culture, a completely new emphasis on the study not just of warfare, but diplomacy. And so you look today at the numbers that we have in our armed forces, smallest number that we've seen since World War II, but yet with the largest obligations and commitments overseas that we've had since World War II. But for a moment, to analyze the force structure is pretty impressive, what we have accomplished in this country in our force structure. 40 to 50% of our officer corps has master's or doctor's degrees. That's an astounding number. I don't know many professions that can boast of those kind of numbers. Over half of our officer corps have college degrees, at least bachelor's. Our enlisted corps, up about 10% in our enlisted corps with bachelor's degrees. Best educated force structure, better than any force structure the world's ever seen. Now, how do you maintain this? How do you sustain this kind of force structure, especially at a time when I noted, and you know, we are committed in 130 nations around the world. Half of our active duty Army is overseas in 130 nations. 500,000 men and women in uniform in the United States Army today. Our reserves, Army reserves, are somewhere around 200,000. Our Army National Guard somewhere around 350,000. And as you know, in Iraq, where we have 150,000 troops serving today, mostly all Army and Marines. About 42% of that force structure is National Guard and Reserve. Now I want to stop there for a moment because it's important to recognize the kind of pressure that we now have on our force structure. Not only commitments that go well beyond a force structure that can probably address those, but in two very hostile countries. In fact, one country at war still, Iraq, where we're losing men and women every day, and Afghanistan. With 500,000 active duty men and women in the Army, where you have half already overseas, you are rotating these men and women out at a tempo that we have never seen before. So, as the former Deputy Secretary of Defense knows, when you rotate people out of those deployments, and now in Iraq, for example, Afghanistan, it's 1 year for Army, Marines, 7 months. They normally rotate out to have some downtime, family time, other interests. But what's happening is because we have limits on our force structure, is that these men and women are being rotated out after a year and almost put right back into another rotation cycle of training and preparation for the next rotation. And many men and women who are in Iraq and Afghanistan today are on their second, most on their second, or even third tours. And that includes National Guard and Reserve. Now what is a consequence of this, and what are the consequences beyond just the immediate? Well, if you look at some recent numbers, and I suspect you have and you will as you study this, you will see that our recruitment and retention ratios are falling. You will see that our Reserve Army and National Guard, and now even our active duty Army, and for the first time, Marine Reserves, are not meeting the monthly requirements. In the case of the Marines, it's the first time in years that's not happened. I noted in yesterday's Washington Post a big story about what's happening on college campuses around the country. And the story talked about the dramatic decline in ROTC individuals. There's a decline over the last 2 years of over 16% of ROTC scholarships interest. This is particularly dangerous because it is from the ROTC ranks that more than 6 out of 10 officers come for our military. And it is the Army ROTC programs that are the ones in the most difficulty. So as you calibrate all of these realities and all of these numbers, you come to some general conclusion, and that is if we are to continue to commit our force structure more and more overseas, taking these roles on essentially ourselves, and retention or recruitment is going down, and you are seeing more casualties, not just in killed in action, but wounded. Where does that lead us? Well, I think everyone understands that always the mission must match the resources. And without those resources, not only will there be a disconnect between the military mission, but with a larger framework understanding of geopolitical strategic interests, there will also be a failure of foreign policy objectives. And it is the foreign policy objective that directs the military objective. And at a time when our threats and challenges are far more complicated than we've ever seen, terrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, real security issues not only in the United States but around the world, then all of these come together in overlapping circles. In fact, there's an integration of all these dynamics. And it is, after all, not structure or any component of government or policy that is most essential, but it's the people. Whether it's this institution or any institution, It is the people, quality people, capable people, people committed, and people. What also is happening at this time is not only an officer corps problem, but those senior non-commissioned officers, those enlisted members of our armed forces, who essentially, and I certainly don't want to offend any officers in here, but it is the enlisted, non-commissioned officer corps. It is the backbone of an army. It's the sergeants who run the army. And as you are seeing that inventory of senior enlisted NCOs start to dwindle, then that's going to be a huge hole in the structure of your forces. One of the most dramatic revelations to Soviet generals and later Russian generals, beginning in the mid-'80s as we went forward, when we started to had some exchanges, as Secretary White knows, with the Soviets. And their generals would visit our training camps, and we would go over and visit theirs. And one of the most dramatic revelations that the leadership of the Soviet Army and later to be Russian Army had was how qualified, how strong our enlisted corps was, how well trained they were, how responsible they were. And that struck the Russians and the Soviets more than any one thing about our force structure, because they understood, as every general since the beginning of time has understood, it is that core enlisted NCO rank that runs the military. So we've got all these pieces floating around, and the question is, well, Senator, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to continue to keep getting us into Iraq? Are you going to continue to keep making commitments? Are you going to continue to keep blowing back alliances and doing it your way? Or how do we fix the problem? Well, there is a problem, or otherwise you wouldn't be studying this. And it will become a very difficult problem to fix and a very dangerous problem to deal with if we're not wise now in how we move forward. The all-voluntary Army. The all-voluntary Army works, in my opinion. I don't think you would want to see a time when we go back to a draft. I don't think it would work if we did, for one reason, many reasons, but let me just take the first one. The sophistication of our equipment and the technology. This isn't a bunch of guys like my brother and me getting 8 weeks training at Fort Bliss, Texas, and then going to advanced infantry training, then being sent to Vietnam and given a rifle, and as long as you could hit anything 20 yards away, they said, "You're just fine, Private. Here's your helmet." That was a different world, different day. This is a different time. You think of what an infantryman is equipped with today, and yes, by the way, we are still going to need infantrymen. Now, I remember many debates in the Foreign Relations Committee, and we had very smart generals up testifying, saying that this deal in Iraq will be over quick. Now, we've got sophisticated smart bombs, and we can hollow it out, and we can put those babies right down a chimney, and we've got satellites, and we can do these things, and we won't need the manpower, and we've got incredible global positioning, and unmanned drones and satellites can deliver missiles. It's true. Need them? Absolutely. They enhance our capability. But you still need the infantrymen on the ground, just as we see in Iraq, with 150,000 men and women in Iraq. You still need that. You will always need that. You take one infantryman, and the cost to train that one infantryman, and the investment that you put in training that infantryman, and then you look at what he or she is equipped with. It's astounding. The communications, the sophistication of the weaponry, the masks, the map reading. This is not just an easy training process that you can pick anybody off the street and say, why don't we get this guy and he can do it and it'll work. No, it's different than that. Plus, it would break down the entire professionalism of a structure that's taken us over 30 years to build. So I don't think the draft is the answer. What I do believe that we are going to need to do to address this issue is first stay concentrated on recruiting quality individuals. And those quality individuals have to understand the commitment our country has, certainly to them and their families. That means educational benefits, that means housing, that means health care, as much as anything else. At a time when our pressures on our budget are immense, that's going to mean more money. We just passed, by the way, in the emergency supplemental appropriations bill last week, one of my bills, and I've got a number of them out there, to increase supplemental death benefit benefits from 120 or 12,000 to 100,000. I've also got legislation out there to do away with the $1,200 investment that the military person has to invest in order to get his military education benefits. I didn't have to do that. Senator Dole didn't have to do that. Others didn't have to do that. I think that's something that we can do. And there are other areas that will cost money to keep the military competitive for these quality men and women. We're also going to have to do something that we haven't done in a long time. We're going to have to put an emphasis on diplomacy. Public diplomacy you hear a lot about. We've essentially had no public diplomacy the last few years. I think as much the key to the answer of our future force structure is going to depend on strengthening our alliances, building coalitions, making sure those coalitions of common interest understand that the challenges of today, the 21st century challenges, just as they were after World War II, just as they were in World War II, are common to the interest of all men and women, are common to the interest of all nations, all societies, regardless of religion, regardless of any other difference. Terrorism, extremism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, that is not a threat to the United States alone, or to Western Europe or Eastern Europe alone, or Japan alone. It's a threat to mankind. And we are going to have to build these coalitions of common interests, just as we did after World War II, when we built NATO, United Nations, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, to bring the world together in common purpose. One of the reasons you do that, aside from the geopolitical, strategic, and economic benefits, but it directly relates to our force structure. Because the stronger we can help make these coalitions, the more pressure that takes off of our own military, of our own troops. It is difficult to do. The Europeans, our European allies in NATO, most every one of them. Secretary White had to deal with this, I know, as much as anything else when he was at the Pentagon, have been going this way with their defense budgets. We did that for the first 6 years of the 90s because what was the threat? Soviet Union had imploded. There was no evil in the world left. It was boundless opportunities in democracy as far as the eye could see. What was the threat? So for 6 years, we cut our defense budget, we cut our intelligence community budget, and we even cut our State Department budget. For 2 years, the State Department didn't even hold exams for new officers, diplomatic officers. So we brought some of this on ourselves. It teaches us a good lesson about the world, a lesson that we continually learn generation after generation. But to strengthen those alliances doesn't diffuse our purpose and power in the world, it enhances it. And that is, I think, a critical part of any dynamic as we move forward in dealing with this real issue that you're studying now. The future of the voluntary army, but the future of our force structure to protect the security of this country. And also, without that, understand this, that force structure. We are limited. The president is limited. Our country is limited on what flexibility he has with foreign policy. This also connects into America's competitive position in the world, our strategic interests, oil, energy. Now, I think we all have some understanding that this country is going to have to diversify its energy portfolio, wider, deeper, alternative fuels. But it's going to have to focus on those domestically produced fuels as well. The fact is that carbon-based fuels are going to be used for some time in the world. We need to move away as quickly as we can. A lot of that is coming through transportation, and we're making progress there, not fast enough. Hybrid motors, clean diesel, electric, gasoline motors, hydrogen. That technology will advance us, and we need to focus on that and probably put a Manhattan Project kind of emphasis on it. I don't think we're emphasizing it enough, harnessing public and private efforts. But nonetheless, all of these things come together in an integrated pattern that are critical for our future. And a good deal of the world, the United States still leads the world. We will lead the world for, I suspect, many years to come. That doesn't mean that we dictate to the world. It means we lead the world. That means we work with our partners, and we enhance the relationships, and we strengthen our friendships, and we put investment in institutions like the United Nations and NATO to make those institutions work. Every institution is not without flaws and gaps. I don't know of one institution that is not without those liabilities. But the answer is not to dismantle it. The answer is to provide the leadership to adjust it, to calibrate it to the 21st century challenges that we face today. Those institutions that we built after World War II have done a tremendous amount to keep this world relatively safe. No nuclear war, for example. No World War III, for example. The great good that's been done in the world the last 60 years. Not everybody's benefited from that. Not everyone has enjoyed that. That's right. But you think of what's happened in the world in the last 60 years to get us to this point to do so much more in science, in health. There isn't a dimension, an arena, a universe that we haven't seen incredible acceleration of progress. Now, we must be wise enough today to not only lead in this kind of a world, but to manage that and to bring all nations into this opportunity to prosper and to bring all nations up. Stability and security in the world directly relate to the kind of commitments we make or don't have to make. And if we're wise, we will take that course of action. I think we will take that direction. If for no other reason, this is a flexible country in the sense of our fiber is strong of who we are. We have a self-correction process that's inherent in our system. The people of a country and that culture, that society, are the strength of that society. I reflect the people I represent. The people who send me to the United States Senate, I represent. I'm a part of them. I'm a reflection of them. Doesn't mean that they agree with me on every issue, but that's not the point. The system does work if the system is engaged and worked, just as you all know, and why you're probably attending this institution, why you're here this afternoon, why you care. So it can be fixed. It will be fixed. Last point I would make, we will need to bring into balance these commitments versus our resources. And not only from our fiscal responsibility dynamics, our budget, which we continue to run multi-billion, hundreds of billions of dollars of deficits, which further weaken our country, which further weaken our economy, which further weaken our competitive position in the world, putting more burden on our force structure. That balance has to come back around with a new responsibility, and that new responsibility will come from a wider lens understanding of the world. And that means America's role in the world. And it also means what America's limitations are. Great powers are not unlike any institution or any individual. We have limits to our power. And great powers have been destroyed because they either refused to understand that or they just didn't understand that. And that, too, is a part of the great challenge of our time in this country. I have no doubt, though, because of who we are, as I said, and this process we have, and the great power and flexibility of our economy, that we will seize this moment. We will not squander this time, and we will do like every generation in the history of America has done. It will accept the challenges, it will achieve the objectives, and they will leave this country and the world better than they found it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Since this is all part of spring exercise, I would like to do something that's very unusual in the forum. It's a public forum, but I'd like to ask that MPP students, or people engaged in the exercise, do the questioning, because we only have a limited amount of time for questions. So my apologies to those of you that had other thoughts, but given limited time, I'd like to move forward. So assuming we have such questions. We're going to go around the audience like this. I just remind you that, again, our goal here is to identify yourself, keep the questions short, end them with a question mark, starting right here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Senator Hagel, thanks for coming today. It's a real pleasure. My name is Mark Linton. I'm in the MPP program. You spoke at the beginning about how the quality of any institution at its heart rests with the people that it has, the human resources. In your mind, is the military and its the force structure, are they balancing, have they achieved the right balance between the resources spent on its human resources versus other line items, for example, weapon systems, advanced technology, and whatnot? If not, how would you rebalance that?
I think generally the Defense Department budget is fairly well balanced. The problem is we are so far behind in our requirements. For example, 2 years in Iraq has chewed up materiel and equipment like nothing we've seen. We are terribly behind in research and development on new weapons, new generations of weapons, because those are easy budgets to rob. You don't see those. You can't rob budgets for your people, for hospitals and the things that we need right now. We don't have enough resources right now. And there comes a time when, as you know, and I mentioned in my remarks, that the overall budget, we have a $2.5 trillion budget that we are debating now for fiscal year 2006. Our Defense Department budget right now is over $400 billion. Actually, it's more than that when you count other accounts into this. We've not even included the three $80 billion supplemental appropriation bills that we've passed for Iraq. Almost all of it's been for Iraq. So that balance is going to require some tough choices here. And it's bigger than just the force structure question you ask. It's the overall balance of the budget. Governing is about making tough choices. Governing is about leading and prioritizing your resources, and we have not done that. And we are letting this country down and failing this country every time we don't do that. And the longer we defer the tough choices, the more difficult it's going to be. But overall, I think the balance is probably about right, although I think we're going to have to, as I said earlier, in order to retain the quality of the force structure we have and continue to enhance it, because there is no such thing as a status quo. Either things go backward or they go this way. We're going to need more money in that budget for human resources and for our people.
Thank you.
Right up here.
Thank you, Senator Hagel. My name is Matt Lindsay. I'm also an MPP1. I have a question still tagging on sort of the fiscal issue. With the House passing the estate tax repeal, making it permanent the other day, and with Social Security looming and all these other things, you've talked about making some tough decisions. Do we need to cut some spending from somewhere to reallocate towards the Defense Department, or do we need to come up with more revenue? What could you give us a little more enlightenment? Because all of us are going to have to answer that question as we do this project. Where are we going to get the money to fix this problem?
Well, more to the point, not only are you going to have to answer the question, you're going to have to pay the bills. And so that should keep you very focused on the burden that we're leaving for you unless we turn this irresponsible, profligate governing that we are responsible for around. I think you're going to have to do all of what you mentioned, all of the above. I've never thought that you can deal with any of these big problems in compartments. And we'll do a little entitlement reform over here, and then we'll do a little tax reform over here, and then if we get to it, if we feel like it, maybe we'll even cut some spending over here. It is in the entire arc of interests that you've got to deal with. Yes, we're going to have to cut spending. Yes, we're going to have to increase revenues. Yes, we're going to have to prioritize where those budget dollars are going. And another reason, again, I say, and I made this point earlier, why we're going to require these strong alliances so that we don't have to continue to carry the burden of being the world's policeman and all the other burdens that we're carrying. It is the total framework of all these issues under one housing that we're going to have to deal with. I'm going to give a speech to the National Press Club on Thursday about this issue, about the entire dynamic of your question, and I'll send you a copy of it if you're interested. And I'm going to lay out some suggestions as to how I think we can deal with it, aside from the things that we can do right now. Cut spending. We're going to have to get to entitlement reform legislation, not only Social Security, but Medicaid and Medicare. Every year those budgets are gobbling up more and more and more of our budget. We're not going to have any money left for defense. So something's going to have to be done here. We can't saddle you with these kind of burdens because it will be impossible for you to carry it. We cannot tax you enough in 20 years to carry through the obligations that we're making right now, the commitments that we're making now. One last number on this, you probably know about it. It's a little bit off the track, but it's not. Over the next 75 years, General Accounting Office, Social Security Administration, Medicare trustees are saying that we have about a $44 trillion unfunded liability in these programs. Sheila knows all about this. She's been working on this for years. I mean, you stop and think about that, what that means. That's $44 trillion worth of commitments to the people of this country that we don't know how we're going to pay for in Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right up here.
Senator Hagel, my name is Andrew Stober. I'm also a MPP student here. As the nation prepares for the 21st century and our military challenges, particularly terrorism, can we possibly afford to be dismissing soldiers purely based on their sexual preference? And I think particularly of the soldiers who bring critical skills and those recently dismissed soldiers who were Arab language translators.
Well, the quick answer, in my opinion, is no. We're going to have to focus on that issue as well, because that is a problem that has not caught a lot of attention in the general public and the media, but it's a problem. I've had long conversations with people I admire greatly, starting with Colin Powell, and a lot of these men and women who devoted their lives to public service, to making the institutions that we are so proud of in this country, and make them work. And don't ask, don't tell seemed to me to be as probably as good a compromise as we could come up with there. But I'm not sure that we're playing fair with that policy. Don't ask, don't tell. That's what it means, unless there is some overt act or action that would disqualify an individual from being protected by that policy. So your question's a good one, and I fear that we're going to have to pay more attention than we are now. Not just for the reason that you mentioned of dismissing people who are critical MOS people, but it's the culture of the force structure, and more importantly, the confidence and trust that our soldiers have in that policy and the confidence and trust that they'll be protected by that policy.
Right down here.
I'm Sunny Gettinger, and I'm also an MPP1 here at the Kennedy School. My question actually also sort of tags to demographic questions. There's some critics who question the voluntary nature of the Army given, or the military given, the targeting of economically depressed and minority neighborhoods, and a disproportionate focus on recruiting people who maybe don't have other options. How do you answer these criticisms?
Well, I think they're a little overstated. We have options in this country. We have a lot of jobs in this country, and I don't question, because I've seen some of it, a rather enthusiastic and aggressive effort by some recruiters to go into the areas that you're talking about and promise them everything. And those recruiters need to be weeded out very quickly, and I think drummed out of the Army, because it's dishonest and it hurts the institution. But I think there's an overstatement there that somehow we're forcing people in to the military because they have no other options. I just don't think that's overall a problem. Are there specific examples of that? I'm sure there are, and I suspect some of these recruiters are to blame for that. But I don't think that's an overriding problem. At least I've never seen any evidence of it.
Very good. Down here.
Thank you for coming, Senator. My name's Lori Krasulik, and I'm MPP1. I have a question getting back to the increasing the size of the Army and the magic number of 40,000. And I know the Department of Defense has resisted the increasing, the numbers. A lot of that on the premise that we need a different mix of specialties as opposed to just adding sheer numbers, and that we just have a Cold War Army that's designed improperly to fight the threats of today. I was hoping you could comment on that.
Well, your question and observations are, I think, at the core of the transformation of a 21st century force structure. Secretary Rumsfeld's dealing with it. Secretary White dealt with it when he was there. Secretary Perry, Cohen, all our recent leaders of the Pentagon have had to deal with it and are continuing to deal with it. And you just mentioned some of the very specific pieces of it. For example, when you look at the responsibilities that our Army Reserve, Army National Guard have in Iraq or in Afghanistan, why is that? Well, because our active duty Army didn't maintain any transportation units, specialties, linguists, military police, civil affairs officers. Those were found in Army Reserves and National Guard. And so we became dependent, and it worked theoretically pretty well when you didn't have a war to fight. And now this Iraqi war becomes the first real test, in my opinion, of the all-voluntary Army. It's the real first test. Because tests in the military don't ever really come until there's a war, until men and women die, until there is a new emphasis on war. Then you find out where the gaps are and the deficiencies. And so we are working our way through that. Now, you talk about the increase in our force structure. Senator Jack Reed from Rhode Island and I have the bill to increase the in-strength of the Army by 30,000, Marines by 5,000. It was Senator Reed and I who got our amendment through last year to increase the in-strength of the Army by 20,000. So some of us are trying to pay some attention to this, but structurally and budget-wise we can do that. But if you don't have 50,000 new troops out there that you're going to be able to recruit somewhere and convince that this is noble and worthy and a professional future for you and your family, it won't make any difference what legislation Senator Reed and I pass unless the people are out there. But your question is right at the core of the transformation that's going to have to be made, and to some extent is in play now, to take the kind of pressure off these, especially these specialties, and to rebalance our force structure so that it will then more capably adjust to these new threats. Thank you.
Right up here.
Thank you, First Senator. My name is Akira Tsuchiya, also MPP1. My question is a little macro perspective, probably. The transformation of the structure of the military branches, there's been always a discussion on the integrating the Marine to some of us or the National Coastal Guard and stuff. Given that situation in the 21st century, having this advanced technology, what would you view as like a future structure of the different branches and how it's going to be integrated or disseminated? Could you give me your insight? Thank you.
Well, I don't know how much you know about this subject, but certainly many people here know an awful lot about it. Some here actually helped create the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986, which did essentially what you were talking about doing, integrated our force structure, but our command and control force structure. So, for example, in Omaha, at Offutt Air Force Base, the home of Strategic Command, used to be SAC, Strategic Air Command, we have a Marine four-star general in charge of Strategic Command in Omaha. Up until a few years ago, we'd always had a four-star Air Force general. Now we have a Marine running Strategic Command. Being an Army man, I question that, but nonetheless, the Marines are becoming better and better educated. All you Marines, don't be upset with me on that. It's just a joke. But that's an example of what Goldwater-Nichols did to start integrating commands, which I think was exactly the right thing to do. It's worked, I think, very, very well. The professionals tell me it has, but like anything, it needs to continually be adjusted and framed and nourished and fine-tuned based on the threats of our day. I would not want to ever see, however, an integration of services get to the point where they're all kind of, is that a Marine or an Army man? I don't think that's good. I like the Marines where they are, and there's a culture. And for you Marines here, you know about your culture. That culture is really important. I think for the Army, it's a culture, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard. The integration of command is important, and the integration of other responsibilities, working together, as we're doing more and more, working very well, I think, in every way, not just in Iraq, but everywhere. That's good, but to go beyond that, I don't think you'd, at least I don't think you'd want to do that.
We're going to have time for 2 more questions right up here.
Hello, Senator. My name is Michael Itu. I'm an MPP1. My question focuses specifically on the recruiting of more or better trained troops for the transformed Army of the years to come. And as we venture out into this project, I'm sure we're going to see a slew of suggestions from different think tanks, elected officials, et cetera, of 1 or 2 great policies that's going to solve the recruiting shortfall, if you would. In your opinion, with what you've seen, which one policy or which one school of thought in that realm would you say steer clear of? There are some serious issues. And building off of that, is there one specific thing that you believe Army recruiters should be focusing on to bolster their numbers?
I don't think there's one specific thing. It's like everything in life. You choose a college, you choose a husband or a wife, you choose a bicycle, a car. I hope not with the same consideration, but usually you take into account more than just 1 or 2 qualities of your wife. Maybe not, but it's the same thing, I think, like this. It's a composite of all these dynamics that add up, that give you the answer. And to try to single one out in recruiting, I'm not sure you could do it anyway. But your larger question, though, is one that we're going to be wrestling with this as to staying away from a certain direction. I had an interesting question asked today. My Chief of Staff, Luann Linehan, is here, and her son, who just graduated from Hastings College last spring in Nebraska, he's a Marine officer now and going to be a Marine aviator. But I was asked with Luann about 2 hours ago at a meeting, Senator, why don't we do what many countries do, and that is just hire out some of the smaller nations' military and just bring the Fiji warriors in and the Angolans and so on, and you just make the Angola division in the Army and the Fiji division in the Marines. And I said, well, that's an interesting thought. You know, the Hessians, and I mean, there's historical precedent for that, not in the United States. I said, I don't think that'll ever be done in the United States because we have a culture that will not allow that, and if for no other reason. The greatest power on earth cannot defend itself. We have to go outside our borders of 300 million people to hire those to protect us. I don't think that'll work, but I suppose there are some who might think that would be a good idea, and let the Haitians of our day, the Fijis and so on, do all the dying and fighting and pay them well, and what's wrong with that? There is actually some dynamic of that, as many of you know, at the United Nations. Most of the peacekeeping troops in the United Nations are from smaller nations who actually make some money on that. But I don't think we're quite there yet. I hope we never will be. But I mentioned that when you asked the question, what direction should you stay away from? I think the answer is right here, where we are and who we are, and we take the great strength of our country and our structure and our people, and we'll find those answers right now. The professional Army of today, the all-voluntary service has worked. Now, when I responded to the question over here, I said, you never know until you go to war. And so the real test, the only test, first test of an all-voluntary Army was Iraq. And we found some big gaps, and we found some problems. But we can fix those problems here.
Last question, quickly.
Thank you very much. My name is Lisa George. I'm also a first-year MPP student. And Senator, I was wondering if you talked a little bit about the increasing stress on the armed forces as they're seeing more and frequent rotations over in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that's obviously going to lead to increased stress psychologically when they return, not only on themselves but on their families. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what the armed forces in general are doing to help our soldiers reintegrate not only domestically with their families, but into civilian society when they're done with their tours of duty.
Well, that's an important question, and it probably was first raised after Vietnam. And you all know the stories of Vietnam veterans coming back, and not that Vietnam veterans coming back had any more post-traumatic stress syndrome than Korean War veterans or World War II veterans, but we became wiser and we became more aware of it, and we have a society that wants to deal with those kind of problems, and we faced it. We didn't fix everybody, but for the first time it was the Vietnam War that pushed this dynamic out into society and made us deal with it. In past wars we've just said, well, that's too bad, that's war, that's what you expect, and if you become a raging alcoholic or whatever, that's just part of it, and we're sorry. We'll do the best we can for you. The money that's gone into our VA facilities to treat these issues, counseling, so on, have been significant and continue to be significant. What are we doing today? We're building on what we learned from Vietnam, these Vietnam vet centers, which I had something to do with installing when I was at the VA, when I was the Deputy Administrator in the Veterans Administration. Far more research and understanding and medical clinical history on how to deal with these things. You're exactly right, these pressures are real. Not unusual when men and women are in these situations, not everybody, but it takes a toll. It takes a big toll. And we will never ever work our way out of that completely, I suspect, but we do need to put a focus on it, a responsibility on it, and come up with the resources to help these people, because I think our government owes it to them. Our country owes it to them.
Thank you very much, Senator Hagel.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
I'm afraid the senator does need to get to another commitment, so we'll have to run. But thank you all again.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, guys.